The Joy of Motherhood by Buchi Emecheta. Chapter 12. Men at War. It was difficult for men with no qualifications to find work in the early 1940s. In growing numbers they were leaving their village homes to look for jobs in Lagos, and this phenomenon was robbing many areas of their most able-bodied men. Those who left reckoned that it was better to go and work for a master or a company rather than stay on their own farms, where income depended upon the whims of the weather and upon their own physical strength. In such circumstances, when men grew old, their sons naturally took over the farming of the family lands, and their daughters, from wherever they were married, from time to time gave little contributions of tobacco and soap, or chunks of wood for warming the fireplaces. For inland in the villages, especially during the Harmattan season, the temperature drops very sharply, sometimes to 12 degrees centigrade or below, which to old people used to the weather, being over 20 degrees, can seem very cold indeed. But the younger generation, like Noigo and her friends, preferred to leave this type of life behind. The Yorubas had been in Lagos a long time, since the fall of the Great Benin Empire, but the Ibos were one of the last groups to follow this drift. Though they missed the sense of belonging which existed in their village communities, the advantage of working in the towns was that wages were more regular. The payment might be meagre, but they soon learned to tailor their needs to their means. People seldom took their jobs lightly. They could not afford to. Naif was among the lucky few who found work with the government. Thus employed, one could hardly be sacked, and could rest assured the morning would never come when one was told that was that and there was no more work to be done. On top of that, if one stayed in government service long enough, one was sure of a small pension, something still quite new to most Ibos. Not many people enjoyed such luxuries. Those who did were from the few privileged families who came into contact with the Europeans early, and who instinctively recognized the coming trends and were willing to change. In places like Asaba and Abuja, Ibo towns in western Nigeria, the inhabitants were very hostile to the arrival of Europeans, so that the few white people who came fled for their lives. The graves of many missionaries and explorers tucked inside the forest bushes tell this tale. However, Naif had been willing to try out this new venture. He did not mind being a grass cutter, because he knew that one day he would be lucky. He would give the proper handshake to the right clerk, who would push his papers in the office for him to be transferred from grass cutting to employment in the workshops. This was one of the reasons why he still sometimes attended church, for most of the preachers and lay readers were clerks from the railway, and one of them, called Dokafa, had even promised to see to his papers after Naif had given him the appropriate dash of £5. Occasionally Naif would see the Sokafa and shout, "Good morning, sir," and the other would grunt his reply. No one expected a big man to be too familiar with such subordinates as labourers and grass cutters. There were about 12 of them in his group, and they had devised a way of working harmoniously with one another. One person in turn would be the lookout, watching to see when the head man approached. The others would cut the grass at a leisurely pace, for they had a saying, "Na government work, I no day finish." It is government work, it can never come to an end. They justified their slowness by saying, "If we finish all the work, what will our children do? So we had better take our time." In the railway compound at Yaba, Lagos, the grass cutters did not need to worry themselves about what they would do the following day, because before a week was out the grass would spring again ready to be cut. They therefore seemed to be going round in circles, ending up where they began. After a while, one got used to this type of job. Not only did Naif get used to the routine, he would have preferred to go on working this way, but for the occasional lack of money. He had become so accustomed to being outside that he feared going to work in the foundry in such a hot temperature that he would have to work almost naked, as he had seen some of his friends do. On the morning after the problems with his wives, he sat down with his colleagues under the cashew tree, none of them much in a hurry, to start their daily work. Naif had not brought any food for his breakfast, and the others knew why. "Are your women still on strike?" asked one skinny man by the name of Ibik. The others laughed, and so did Naif, helping himself to Ibik's curry and some dried fish from another person. They all shared their food, so they did not mind him taking part of their provisions. "No," said Nathan between mouthfuls. "The shop steward came to me just by the road there, to say that she is repentant, and that she admits she was in the wrong." The others laughed again. "You mean they have given up so soon?" Naif shook his head. "I don't think the other one has. The senior one is a trader, and she knew that if she didn't do something, the family, with the exception of myself, of course would end up eating all her profits. That's why it's good to encourage women to trade, so that they know the value of money." "What did you say to her?" "I didn't say much. You see, suspect she is expecting another child, judging from the way she is behaving. She is usually a very good woman. She comes from a big household. But she could not bring her household here to help you cut the grass, put in another worker as he got up to look out for the headman. He gave the sign that the boss was on his way, so the others set about swinging their cutlasses in the air, leaving their half-eaten food under the tree, and started to sing as they worked. One man would clear his throat and start a song, and the others would answer in the call and response pattern typical of African music. Their cutlasses would swing in the air during the call and would land with a swish on the grass towards the end of the refrain. Watching them work, and the rise and fall of cutlasses, was an entertainment in itself. One enthusiastic worker would sometimes stop cutting for a moment or two to do a solo dance before going back to his work. Of course, when the headman went away, they soon stopped to get their breath back. During that afternoon, they noticed that there were army trucks coming into the yard. They wondered what was going on, though they could not stop work to stare very long. They saw European officers with formidable moustaches, looking strong and wicked, and there were the tall horse soldiers with their truncheons, who were known locally as Kurofos, army policemen. This latter group was very feared. Their methods of searching for deserters were well known. Many young Nigerian men thought it would be fun to join up, especially after going to the Labour Office day in, day out, and having their efforts at finding jobs thwarted, and some found out too late that the rigours of army life were not for them, and would run home to their mothers. These army policemen left no stone unturned to locate such a deserter. Perhaps part of the reason they were feared was that few people in the south of Nigeria understood their language. Some said they spoke Hausa, some that they spoke a kind of language called Munshi. But whatever they spoke, there was no doubt that they were much taller than the average southerner. Most of them were at least 6 feet 3 inches tall, and many were much more than that. On this day in the railway yard, the Kurofos were parading up and down, as if in search of something. They watched the grass cutters singing, but showed no reaction. The European officers looked beyond them, as if they did not exist, just as adults might look indulgently at children, shrug their shoulders and say, "Let them have their fun." There was the usual stampede when the whistle blew, and it was time to wash and go home. Some of those who moved fast were already on the bridge over the railway line. Naif wished his friends good night, and was on the verge of joining the crowd that had just reached the bridge when from all corners came the Karofos swinging their truncheons in the air. A European officer stood behind them saying something to the Karofos. It was not clear what was happening, but by the look of things it was not anything pleasant. Many of the workers ran back into their workshops and others ran out into the open street. Up went the truncheons and the Karofos were giving orders. From ear to ear. Go, go into the lorry, go, go. Men screamed like women as some of them were caught. Naif was one of them. He found himself being pushed and bundled into the tarpaulin-covered army lorry. Why? Why? Workers asked each other. Nobody had an answer. Naif saw a few of the men try to make an escape, but they only felt heavy truncheon blows landing on their shoulders, and their squeals of pain warned the others to stay put and be good boys. We don't have slavery anymore, so why should grown men be captured in broad daylight? Naif wondered. He was too stunned to think of his family. All that went through his mind was the unfairness of it. He was so preoccupied with this that he could not make out if they were going to Lokoi barracks on the island or the ones in Apapa, or even the ones he had seen so often at Igbobi and Yaba. He was hungry, he was shocked, and he was angry. How could one resist against men armed with heavy sticks and guns? They were ushered into an open field and their names were taken. They were all told to have something to eat, and that an officer was coming to talk to them. Naif was reluctant at first, but seeing others eating he too ate, telling himself that at least the problem of hunger was solved, so that when they let them go he would have enough strength to walk home. He became really alarmed when, after the food, a medical doctor came to examine them one by one. Naif knew then that he was done for. It was at that moment that he looked round and saw that his fellow worker Ibik was there, looking as stunned as he was. They communicated with each other through looks. There was little they could do but wait and see. The doctor, an Indian, knocked at Naif's chest, peered into his throat and ears, before pronouncing him all right. That much Naif heard. All right for what? He was about to turn round and ask, but a Karofo pushed him along to make room for another man who came in stripped to the waist like himself. In the corridor where they were asked to wait, most of them had subsided into silence, their minds busy as clocks and their eyes watchful. Soon the medical was over. Some people were called, and Naif never saw them again. He and Lubek and about 30 others remained, whereas 60 or so of them had been packed into the lorry. In another room they were eventually told why they had been so enlisted. They were to join the army. A few men had the courage to shout abuse. Others joined in, and an officer with a moustache allowed them to go as mad as they could. After a while, during which time some men wept with tears pouring shamelessly from their eyes, he demanded silence. Later they were told that their wives and relatives would be well cared for. When asked about his next of kin, Naif gave the name of his wife Nuigo. He was told that the large sum of £20 would be paid to her, and that she would be sent similar amounts from time to time. After recovering from the initial shock of his wife and family getting rich through his going to fight for the white man, Naif wanted to know how often this payment would be made. He was informed that it would be about 2 to 4 times in the year. They were assured that they would not be serving any longer than 1 year, since the enemy was on the point of being annihilated. More importantly, they were told when they returned they would all be promoted in their places of work. Naif, for example, would move into the workshop and be apprenticed to a trade on a higher income. After all these promises, the men started to think very carefully. This was a chance to pull their families out of the kind of life they had been living. It had never occurred to them before that this was poverty. Why did not most people live the same way? Anyway, going into the army was bound to raise the standard of living of all of them. Naif reckoned that through his taking the plunge his sons Oshia and Adim would be well educated. So also would his brother's 3 sons at home and Abuser benefit. Naif made up his mind that he must risk it. They were given pen and paper to write to their dependents telling them the best way to spend the money, and, since many of the men could not write, this was done for them by black officers who had been employed for the purpose. Naif later saw Ibik with his head shaved and wearing an uniform. He told Naif that he had asked his wife, he only had one, to go home to their village and wait for him there. His parents would take charge of his income. His children were very young and would not be starting school until their father returned. After all, they were going to be away for only a year. Naif agreed that Ibik had made the right decision. Naif himself would rather Nuigo stayed in Lagos and continued with her trade and looking after the household as best she could. He said she must send £2 to Abuser to pay the year's school fees for the senior Olam's sons at the Catholic school there. The fees were 4 shillings a term, so that would be sufficient. She should follow the same procedure when she received the next payment, but he cautioned her to regard each payment as the last she would ever get. He did not know where they were going, and he did not know whether he would come back alive. Nuigo should give £5 to her co-wife Adaku for her to use to start a trade. The balance of the money they should use to feed their children and pay the rent. Nuigo should see to it that Oshia's and Adim's school fees were paid on time. He convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. He had no choice, anyway. As a grass cutter, his income had only been £5 a month. He had given his wife £3 of it for food, sent 10 shillings to his relatives back home, and paid 10 shillings towards his asusu, a kind of savings among friends whereby each member of the group collected contributions in turn. Whatever was left Naif spent on himself. Things were cheap in those days. Several men could get drunk on a keg of palm wine costing just 6p. Oshia and his brother accounted for 8 shillings every 3 months at school. So on the whole they had been quite satisfied with his small income until this upheaval. He was quite sure that his wife Nuigo would be able to manage. The following morning Nuigo and Adaku were woken by Yabani. He looked sad, and Nuigo was certain that something terrible had happened. "Is Naif dead?" she asked, steeling herself for the worst. "No, he is not dead. He is alive, only they have forced him to join the army." "The army?" the 2 women echoed, not believing what they heard. "How can they force a person to join the army?" was Nuigo's incredulous question. "He is a grass cutter." "Oh, my God, what can we do, Yabani? For me to be married to a soldier, a plunderer and killer of children? Ah, Yabani, can't we do anything?" Adaku, shocked, began wailing and shouting. "I don't know, if death isn't better than this. Poor Naif, why him, why him? There is nothing we can do. The British own us, just like God does, and just like God they are free to take any of us when they wish. In those days things were such that Nigerians had no voice. No paper would report what had taken place. Even if it were reported, how many of those affected could read, and how many could afford to buy a newspaper? New ego then gave in to all the suppressed emotion that was inside her. "How are we going to manage?" she asked Jabani, who, though from the east, had become a close friend. "What are we going to do with all these children? I can't afford to feed us all as well as paying the rent. Your abuser people will be meeting this evening and will discuss the matter. You'll have to learn to forget these superstitions about soldiers. Being in the army is like any other job these days. In fact, if all goes well with my friend, he will be better off when he returns. He won't be a grass cutter anymore. That was what my boss told me this morning. Please don't give up hope. You will hear from him soon. Well, I must go now. I've brought a bag of scones for the children. They are a sweet European food. I hope they like them." With that, Yabani left them. Their room and veranda were soon filled with sympathizers. Even the Yoruba landlord, who was not popular with Naif, lamented, "What type of life do we live when a man with a large family can be abducted in broad daylight?" "It is unbelievable," said Mama Rabi. "I have heard of it happening to other people, but never thought it could happen to someone I know. Why can't they fight their own wars? Why drag us innocent Africans into it?" "We have no choice," the landlord concluded. In the evening, they were even more dismayed to learn from Wakasa that newly recruited soldiers were usually taken out of the country within 24 hours. He tried to reassure the women by saying, "You know, some young farmers nowadays leave abuser for the army, because life there is more secure, and they learn a trade which will be useful to them in later life. Naif will be sending you some money. So it is up to you what you decide to do. Can you two cope with living in this town?" "Well, I can go back to trading when we get the money. I have only one child at the moment, so it will not be too bad. After the birth of this baby, I can carry on again. But I don't know about my senior wife. New ego, you will be better off an abuser," was the unanimous opinion. "Yes, I think that would be the best thing. People have been telling me about my father's illness. He is very old now, and would like to see the boys." The news of Naif's abduction soon reached Abuser. Agbadi sent urgent messages to his daughter to come home. He did not want her to stay there and suffer, and moreover he was dying. "But how can I go without any money, Adaku? You know what worries me too. We don't even know where our husband is, and whether he is alive or dead. I don't know how I would feel if I was asked to kill people who had never offended me. Poor Naif, have you ever known anybody so unlucky?" Adaku shook her head. The letter from Naif eventually arrived, and Nuigo gave it to Mama Rabi to read for her. Then she hurried back to their room to tell Adaku the good news. "Naif is alive and well. He's on his way to a place called India, though he does not know where that is. He has sent us some money and I have to go to the post office to collect it. Your share will be £5, so after the birth of your baby you can rent a stall in Zabo Market and start trading. I won't be able to do anything like that yet. Too many children and my father's poor health. Mama Rabi has advised me to put some of my share away in the post office for the time being. Who will look after it there?" Adaku wanted to know. "The government. Mama Rabi says it will even bring in some interest which should pay for the boy's education. He has sent £20. £2 is for Danquo, our senior wife and abuser, so apart from your share the rest is mine." "Oh, senior wife, you are a rich woman. If he sends any more like that you will be very rich indeed. Have you forgotten that I have all these children to look after? And he says in the letter that we should not count on anything more. Although he will send more whenever possible, he advises us to make the most of what we have, since life is so uncertain. Mama Abby left her own domestic tasks and went with no ego to the post office. There were so many pieces of paper the clerks there required signed, but after a 3-hour-long wait the money was finally actually in Nuigo's hand, and Mama Abby had helped her open a savings account. By the time Adaku had used her share of Nafe's money to establish herself at the Zabo market, Nuigo knew she could delay her journey home no longer. Please, my young wives, if our husband sends any more money, send it to us by anyone coming to abuse her. We will get it. My father is very ill, and I must hurry. I don't want him to go without seeing me and his grandchildren.